So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how familiar you all are with the term native advertising. Maybe I should just ask. Nod or no, I didn't think so. Actually, I started doing research on this topic because I have a background in magazines and publishing before I ever went to library school, and I have so many friends from that world, and I realized that there was this disconnect. I have my librarian friends, and we have our world and what we talk about with information literacy, and then there was this whole other world of friends of mine in publishing who were talking about how now it had become very customary when they were working on a story to do something that was called native advertising, which is pretty much just like writing a magazine story. The only difference is instead of having like a conversation back and forth with an editor, the conversation was like a three-way conversation with an editor and somebody who's a representative from a corporation that is sponsoring this particular story. So it was like this weird middle ground of like not traditional advertising where, yes, there were always pressures from advertisers on your content, on your stories. That was always a reality back in the day. But to have a specific story that commissioned by a particular advertiser that was that was this explicitly advertising but wasn't really supposed to act like advertising or look like advertising was just kind of a new animal. And I felt like, knowing how much I know about how students search for information, that is to say, not necessarily using library databases, I thought this was something that would be a good idea to let librarians know a little bit more about this phenomenon. Because the reality is, we're all accustomed to free information, but the ads that we see that look explicitly like magazine ads, actually, the publications don't really make very much money from them. They don't work very well. They don't make people buy things. So the question is, what does make people buy things? What underwrites journalism? So what is native advertising? So Jonah Serra, who was a columnist for the New York Times, wrote this piece in which he's an older man, and it was really about his ambivalence about native advertising. And a lot of the column was devoted to startup. And so I was going to play an audio clip from Startup because I thought that might be a good way to have you, rather than have me define it, I'm going to have
over native advertising. Native advertising is when advertising looks and feels like the non-advertising content which surrounds it. It's a hot topic in any future of media discussion. You see native advertising on websites, magazines, hear it on the radio, and the problem that people have with it, of course, is that it looks and sounds like the regular content. People can be deceived about what is something somebody's paid to say and what is something they actually believe. And this was particularly heartbreaking because, I'll just go ahead and say this, I feel proud of how we've handled our sponsorships so far. We've made some interesting ads that employ the tools of documentary and storytelling, but we've gone out of our way to highlight with music and words that it is advertising and not editorial content. We've steered clear of what I consider the most troubling aspects of this new model, the possibility of deception. But now, because we had perpetrated, unwittingly, a deception, and this deception was associated with our sponsorships, people were now associating us with the slimier elements of native advertising. So we have this dilemma.
Okay, so the reason why I played that is because I can tell you that this is a hot topic, right, in contemporary future of media conversations, but you'll trust Alex Blumberg. Like he has to wrestle with this all the time. So he was talking about a circumstance when one of his reporters called a family and talked to a boy about his. I can't even actually remember what it was about, but he was interviewing a young boy, and so his mother was kind of in on the the discussion about whether he could be interviewed, but she really thought that it was for This American Life. Like, she thought her son was being interviewed for This American Life by Alex Bloomberg, because the reporter, I think, had said, oh, this is for Startup, and it's, it's Alex Bloomberg, and he was on This American Life. So the mother was really confused, and what ended up happening is it was an ad that was being used in Startup. Their ads are native advertising, where with a few changes in sort of like the background sounds, and with the clear, caveat that this is being coming from a sponsor, you have the actual reporter who is doing that week's story kind of shift gears and create a native ad. And that's the important part of it, is just the native advertising. It means that it sort of is native to the medium it's in. If it's a print story, it's going to be native to print. It's going to be kind of like a New York Times story, right? If it's a print story. If it's if it's in the New York Times, if it's in the Guardian, it's going to look like a Guardian story. If it's in a podcast here, I mean, Startup is a business-focused podcast, and so they're interviewing other businesses. And yes, you need to listen. And he says, "I'm proud of the way we've handled this." They are very clear, but if you're sort of half listening, it may not really seep through that what you're listening to is pure and simple an ad, and that is, I'm not here to in any way slam native advertising. I actually think that it is really important to me that journalists get paid for their work, so there has to be a viable model. But I think people don't necessarily understand that a lot of what you see on websites like videos that might be on a website that you read might actually be directly sponsored by a particular advertiser. So, as I say, I think that we know that as those of us who work in academic libraries, that we talk a lot about the value of using library databases, but we know also that our students are more accustomed to just being on the open web, and we also know that as citizens, they're not going to have access to our databases after they leave. So the question is, how do they navigate this world? I again will just mention this particular column in the New York Times, which was critical of Startup and their way they do advertising, but basically said, oh, the New York Times does native advertising too, but we really clearly market, so it's okay when we do it. And I'll show you an example, and you can decide. The other thing is that I think that the Times has actually changed the design globally so that it is a little more prominent than when that claim was actually made, because I remember thinking that was really funny. Now, I'm just showing you, this is from the Internet Archive. I think it's important to remember that we may be sort of inheritors of a model of news. Like back in the 1930s, Henry Luce at Time magazine, he and his staff talked about something called the separation of church and state, which was a phrase that I think you still hear, and it was used predominantly, from the 30s to the 60s at Time. And what it meant was that advertising and editorial must have no idea what the other one is doing. Like, the way you deal with the inevitable conflicts is you just keep those departments completely separate. You don't have the people talk to each other about what's going on. That, wall was breaking down, I think, long really before the internet. Now, this is an example of a newscaster, and you see it's a 1953 commercial for Camel cigarettes. Camel was a very early advertiser on sponsoring an entire broadcast news show, and it really laid down the law in certain ways, and there were certain things that they did to sort of shape the news. So, for example, they wanted things like coverage of football, because, for male viewers, they had certain things that they didn't want shown, like they didn't want real camels shown on air. That was like banned if you wanted their sponsor. I mean, I know it sounds bizarre, but they only wanted like the cartoon camel. So here, this is an ad of where a newscaster is actually, it's a newscaster guy recommending that you smoke Camel cigarettes. So it's not like this hasn't been a problem over the years, but it's just kind of on steroids now and has been given a particular name. And I think we didn't grow up most of us, I don't think, in sort of the 1950s broadcast news environment, but you can see the conclusion that Time came to in like the 1930s, television came to, in the 1960s, like, no, this is not an appropriate way of kind of making viewers buy products, by sort of merging it with news. And so, as I say, there's nothing really new about this strategy, but now when you have a new medium, the way we have a new medium with the internet and internet news, and the fact that no one's really found a viable model for sponsoring the news that doesn't include this kind of fairly like overt relationships between editorial and advertising. So, okay. Oh, sorry. And I wanted to actually I'm going to play you another example. I hope this is going to be loud enough, but this is one of the controversial ads.
This episode of Startup is brought to you by Ford Motor Company, where engineers wear special suits that make them feel old. Make a car where anyone can feel comfortable.
This is exactly what we have to think about. Who's driving our cars? Not just 20s and 30-year-olds.
I spoke to Katie Allenson, a human factors engineer at Ford. She told me the elderly suit comes with weights on the feet, braces on the knees, torso, neck, and headphones that reduce hearing. It's like a straitjacket, but a popular one. You say the engineers love it. Can you give me kind of an example of what someone said after having that experience?
I had a couple people tell me I've been really hard on my mom. And see, that one really resonated with me as well, because my parents are getting older. She's like, what's taking them so long? Why can't you find your seatbelt? Right? So I mean, it gave them that patience.
So are you actually more patient with them then?
Absolutely.
Ford, literally engineering human kindness. See Ford.com/startup for more on Ford's empathetic design.
Okay, so that is the reporter who was, again, it's very much like a sort of 1950s live, television where you have the newscaster shift and turn and start talking about an advertiser. But I was just going to say, aside from the, mentioning Ford there at the end, what tells you, and it's the same voice, like I say, the same reporter, what tells you that that's a native ad? What do they do? But I mean, like, just besides saying, like, oh, okay, because while you're listening to it, it's the background music, it's the intro music, so it's the startup music. They do use it elsewhere in the show, but like if you're listening to the regular story, you're not going to have the background music, and that's how they've done it. I'm just going to show you sort of like in print. Like this, for example, is a Netflix did a story about women inmates, women in prison. And it's a series of videos, and there's an article, and it's like really all about, women in prison. And then you get to it, and then there's like Piper Kerman, who wrote the book Orange is the New Black, talking about her experiences, and it kind of makes your head explode. Because in a traditional story, you would have a news story about female inmates and their challenges and their challenges reintegrating into society. And then you would also have an entertainment story about a woman who'd written a best-selling book that had become this hugely successful series. You wouldn't have them mashed up together. It's a little strange. Now, as you can see from what Joe Nocera said, it does maybe look a little bit different than the New York Times. You can see it says T Brand Studio. That's their native advertising arm. But it's on their website. It's got the writer has a producer has a byline. And I'm just going to show you another one, which is actually from last week. And this is from The Atlantic. And as you can see, it says The Atlantic right in the corner. It's branded. But this is an advertisement for a TV show called Fauda. So this is also Netflix. And it's an ad about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I don't know how often you look to ads to inform yourself better about what's going on in, one of the most conflict-ridden regions of the world, one of the most controversially so. I mean, Ben even mentioned it. People want to argue about it. But this is a TV show I would almost call it like the homeland of Israel, but actually I think Homeland is Israeli and was made into an American version. So this is like another similar kind of show that the Israelis are really like into, and maybe they're good at making them, but it's called Fauda. And the thing that kind of makes me most upset is the fact that like I never had heard of it. I haven't heard, like I saw this recently, I hadn't heard of it since. Like I actually started doing research on it. Like, oh, maybe I would really like to watch that. So it was totally effective. Like as someone who does watch Homeland, I'd be like, what's this Homeland-like show? But so they got my attention. But the way they got my attention is this ad that it's a bunch of interviews and people like right in the middle of one of the worst, periods in recent memory in this particular conflict. They're putting out this kind of glossy ad, getting you to presumably like watch a television show. So it's like sometimes it isn't so jarring. So for example, when The Imitation Game came out, there was a story that the Times' T. Brand studio ran about Alan Turing, and there was sort of nothing about that would necessarily be that controversial. But I think you just have to ask yourself the question: would students, business students or engineering students, could they use the information in that Ford ad, which is a real interview with a real engineer? Is that a legitimate source? Is this a legitimate source since it's being done basically by journalists? And a legitimate source for what? Like a story about advertising or a story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Anyway, I thought that this is something that our community maybe didn't know much about, and your students and your patrons are consuming it, and it's financing journalism. So I don't know if anyone has a quick question or if we have time for that, but. Okay.
All right, Darcy. I have more something to share and then perhaps a question. I was wondering if you'd come across examples of native advertising in more of a fake news or clickbait environment. And then I have an example that I could share that I just thought of from around the time last year. There was a film, I think it was called The Cure. It was a horror movie. They created their own fake website called like the Sacramento Dispatch, which if you're not from Sacramento, you wouldn't know that it's not real. And they put whole stories about it using kind of twisted quotes from Trump and the Trump administration about penalizing California for welcoming illegal immigrants and sort of declaring themselves as sanctuary states. So they had real quotes from the news. Then they mixed it up with a fake story about, and mudslides in California, which have been happening. They connected this somehow to their fake film story, and there were all these ads on the site for their film. And then when you checked back a few days later, it just took you to a trailer for the film. So I think that's sort of an extreme example of native advertising meets fake news. And I don't know if you've come across anything else like that.
No, but I do have a comment.
Here you go. Comment away.
So my comment is that what most traditional advertisers want is they want credibility, right? So I'm sure, for example, if somebody wants to be associated with these kinds of sites, like someone might pay, and probably a lot of these places are like great, so I would absolutely not say that there is no example of some company or business wanting to be associated with a site that's less than reputable than, but what people who pay for something like this, what Netflix wants, it wants the credibility of the New York Times. It wants more than the coverage that the Times would agree to give them for Orange is the New Black, or that the Atlantic probably wouldn't give this TV show any coverage at all whatsoever. But they want those readers. They want New York Times readers. They want Atlantic readers. They think that those are the people who'd be interested in this. So it's like they want in on the credibility, which is the reason why it is a little different, the layout, but it's also kind of not, and it blends in. And I will also say that one of the earliest sort of controversies involving Native advertising was with the Atlantic, and the Church of Scientology had played, like the Church of Scientology badly wants credibility, so they placed a Native ad that people felt was not sufficiently differentiated from the Atlantic, that they thought was endorsing this organization, and they took it down. Like, you cannot find it. You can find an apology that they ran, but like you can't really, it's not there anymore. They took it down. Most of these, like I can call that Orange is the New Black ad is old, is years old, and you can readily call that up. They're not trying to hide that, but the Atlantic did pull it, and it was a big black eye for them. So much more so than the problems that startup had, or the criticism.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you know, do these kinds of ads, return well for the companies? Are they more effective than regular display ads?
Actually, I brought along, the answer is yes, in short. And in fact, what I would say is, without getting, too into it, I wrote a paper about this, and this is a few years ago, and I wanted to see if anyone in the library field had written about it, if it was in the library literature. It was not then. It is now. But what was interesting is it had been written a lot in the business press. So a little bit in sort of like communications, like anybody writing about journalism would sort of write a little bit critically, potentially, or write some sort of critique or push back a little bit maybe against native advertising, but so for example, one paper from 2012 said that the subtle sponsored content is another name for this phenomenon, was found to be more informative, more amusing, less irritating than a banner ad. Internet users enjoyed reading it, and so the short answer is, I guess it depends on the ad, but like business writers or scholars writing for business journals have covered it very positively. Studies demonstrate that web communities and advertisers benefit from sponsored content, so they basically believe it's an effective advertising tool. It engenders positive response, because actually that's part of it. It's not that you can pinpoint, like maybe you can with Fauda or something, like how many people are watching Netflix, but if it's like Ford, do you know that like tons of startup listeners are like running out and buying Fords? It's like what they want is that in a couple of years, when you have to pick a car to buy, they want you to feel kind of warm and fuzzy about Ford. So what they have found is maybe not so much hard numbers, but definitely increasing a positive view of a particular company. So for another example is the Atlantic has done a lot of like really amusing videos, some of which are like journalism, some of which are explicitly sponsored by Aetna, and that James Hamlin, who's one of their editors, does them. He's very funny. Like they're very funny. He's a doctor, so they're always about some kind of medical topic. And the thing is, they want you to like not think that like Aetna is made up of jerks. Like they may deny your claim, but like they give James Hamlin money to do funny videos, and so you're like maybe that's a good a positive outcome, and maybe more HR people will be like, we're getting Aetna because our employees like Aetna because they have good feelings about it. So I think it's really about engendering a kind of positive attitude about companies that have actually very often people hate, right? Sometimes.
We have time for one more question. I'll go to you, Robin.
Hi. So my question is, where do you see this going? Because you can see the transition into a space where, okay, we need to get more ads, better ads. Let's get this as native as we can, get it into the conversation so it becomes part of the culture and a part of the way things are. And as we look at this, you can see this continuing to happen and figuring out ways to basically companies trying to put a brand out and to advertise something very specific and get to the core of what people are interested in and make that nice warm fuzzy feeling. So where do you see this shifting into the future, and what are some things you think can help people better navigate this?
Well, that's where all of you come in, actually, because no, really, I think it's just we need to become more sophisticated consumers of the news, and I think that's where like the library community comes in, and what Ben was doing comes in. I'm not saying that you need to inform people about native advertising, but it's part of that continuum of it's not fake news, but it's not real news either. Like an example. What I think is so important to remember about native advertising is like it's not like James Hamblin, I think, says anything incorrect about any medical fact at all, but Chevron did a tea brand for the New York Times about the future of energy, and the future of energy is very bright. But it involves fracking, and like the article does not say, oh, and you might have an earthquake in your community. Like it doesn't, and your water might be poisoned. It doesn't say that. It just says, no worries, guys. And the thing is, nothing in that ad is incorrect. It's just that it's not the whole story, and I think that's always kind of the truth. This is probably like not terrible, but is this really getting into the more controversial aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? All that does is alienate people. Like that's not the point of something like this. It's to make you feel good about it. So if we can be more. And if we can sort of incorporate into our practices, I mean, the ACRL framework helped us by basically saying it's not maybe discouraging us from using checklists. Like, as Ben said, I'll keep quoting you, like sometimes just having a conversation around these things, like looking at them, I would ask the question with the Ford ad, if a business student wanted to use that ad as like a primary source in a paper, I would applaud it. If an engineering student was like taking this as rock solid fact that was like absolutely the way it happened with no designed to like sugarcoat it or make it seem more admirable. Like I would say having a more nuanced view of what information can do for us and like how it can be used appropriately, and just to continue to have those conversations and be aware of it, because you're right, it isn't going anywhere. And I think if anything, the expectation of sort of late 20th century journalism and the separation of church and state through the early to mid part of the century, like that whole way of talking about advertising, I think it's just not, it frankly, for most of history wasn't even in practice. It was a luxury maybe that we have. Now we sort of have to be more, we have so much information in so many different guises, we just have to be more critical consumers of it, I think. Oh, thank you.